Well, thank you everyone for coming. This has been it's been such a great event. I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to introduce Lindsey Wikstrom, an architect and longtime friend of the school who is Arizona born and now living and practicing on the East Coast in the tri-state area. It's especially an honor to host Lindsey during our fall open house that many of you have also joined for. Thanks again for coming to both events. And it's not only for prospective students, but for our local community partners, board members, and other old and new friends of TSOA. I hope it's been a warm introduction to the school, if you don't know it already. Tonight we'll be hearing from Lindsey on the impressive body of work of her practice, Mattaforma, whose office is in New York. Lindsey's work, which interweaves many different forms and formats of architectural thinking and scholarship, explores concepts around care and the way it can be enacted through a kind of choreography toward enriching the structures of ecosystems and of our society. Her work, ranging from residential to cultural and institutional projects, includes a notable publication, Designing the Forest and Other Mass Timber Futures, which captures the priorities of her practice by exploring the intersection of environmental relationships and the materiality of mass timber. This can lead toward new imaginations and perceptions of building sustainably that accompany the environmental benefits of reduced carbon emissions and the support of biodiverse ecologies and communities. Designing the Forest expands mass timber design into deep considerations around the entire life cycle of a material in order to work both sensitively and creatively with it. The book, published recently in 2023, offers unique insights and illustrations that range from technical to historical, experimenting with the representation of not just architecture, but its process. Within the rise of mass timber construction, the publication helps us understand this material within a framework of ethics, logistics, labor, carbon emissions, environmental stewardship, and cultures of extraction. I encourage you to all get a copy of this book. The students received an excerpt, and we look forward to having more copies in our library. And I'll mention that it has a foreword by the revered Kenneth Frampton and has received recognitions from the Architects newspaper and Architectural Record. As a personal story, Lindsey and I have had a lot of parallels over the years in which we've worked, and where we've worked, where we've taught, and where we've lived. One of the most interesting recent serendipities is Lindsey's work on Rancho Almazomos, an upcoming ecology and hospitality project near Sedona in Cornville, Arizona, that's next door to the historic John Waddell Studio, where the school has conducted a summer program and is exploring partnerships for the future, hopefully. And was also first introduced to me by Janie Ellis of Cattle Track, so full circle, very small world, especially if you're crossing paths in Cornville via New York City. On this note, I'm excited for Lindsey to share her perspectives and projects that are rooted across deep considerations of place. In addition to the accomplishments already mentioned, Lindsey was also the organizer and moderator of Material Worlds, a speaker series on the future of our most ubiquitous building materials, hosted by MoMA's Emilio Ambas Institute. She's taught at Columbia GSAP, where she also received her M.Arch and the SOM Prize, and has taught at Cornell Architecture, Art and Planning, AAP, Syracuse University, and Yale School of Architecture. Before we begin, I want to gratefully acknowledge our sponsors, including our primary sponsor, Swabak Architects, founded by Vern Swabak and John Sather. Vern was the youngest apprentice of Frank Lloyd Wright, as well as our co-sponsor, the Arizona Architecture Foundation. Both have made the quality of our lecture series possible, and we look forward to announcing our next lectures soon. After the presentation by Lindsey, we'll have an opportunity to ask questions from the audience, moderated by me and our M.Arch student Cameron Liu. If you're getting hungry, we also have a few spots at dinner following the lecture, so if you're interested in joining that, please speak to me after the event. Okay, anyway, thank you for joining the events today, and please give Lindsey a round of applause. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, TSOA, and thank you, Stephanie. It's really nice to be back in Arizona and to be with you all tonight. So thank you for joining us this evening. It's a real treat. So as Stephanie mentioned, I'm Lindsey Wikstrom. I'm leading a firm called Mattaforma. We're based in New York City. We have projects around the country, including here in Arizona. And tonight my talk is called CARE's Choreography, which covers a lot of the ethos of the practice and will eventually end up in the root of the book and talking about the research of the book, which I wrote for students in particular, but anyone who's interested in learning about mass timber and what's at stake and the history of it. So first, a little bit about the word choreography. I've been trying to synthesize this interest in materials and materiality, and I think that the idea when you're thinking about designing for disassembly or sourcing in an intelligent way or in an ethical way, design is much more about choreographing the movement of materials across time and space. So if we all sit here in this room and take a look around at these materials, it's a really interesting space to do this in. Let's imagine everything here is in motion. It came from someplace, it's here paused for just a brief moment while we're here, and it will eventually go somewhere else. So it's true that nothing lasts forever, and there's this motion happening when we do architecture, where we're pausing materials for people to be gathered like this, and then they're going somewhere else. So I would really love for the practice to take on this idea of choreography, and then designing these trajectories of materials. And so that's what my practice is really rooted in. Our first project was called The Nursery at Public Records. This is pretty much a rave space, so this perfect connection to this idea of choreography. I'm no dancer at all, but I love a good rave, and the connection with the client here was an incredible one. They are first and foremost, as Public Records, obsessed with sourcing ingredients, ingredients in their food. They're all fully vegan. They're looking at sourcing water in a really equitable way. They source music in a very intentional way. And so when we connected and I said, listen, you can do that same thing with the materials in your designs, in your architecture, it was a match made in heaven. And so we were really grateful to design this space called The Nursery. At first, they wanted us to design a overwinter garden for their tropical plant collection. And so we started there. The first thing we did was interview all of their plants as if they were our clients. So how do you overwinter best? What's the kind of thermal comfort you need? What kind of shade, sunlight? When do you wake up in the morning? I mean, the whole 9 yards. And we really got to know this collection of plants as clients and designing a space for them. We used simulation tools to understand how solar radiation worked on the site, and specifically with the shipping containers that we had on the site. So they were originally stacked in a weird configuration in the back, and we proposed to arrange them in this U shape in order to capture sunlight. And then we created this timber overhang, which overlapped with the steel in such a way that the steel would absorb solar heat gain during the winter and heat the space passively. We lined the inside of the shipping containers with insulation, and so it was becoming a place that could really be comfortable for these plants. But then this project grew, and they really saw this value of how simply the shipping containers and the timber construction could be a flexible space, a space for events and gatherings. So they brought on this landscape architect, they're phenomenal, called Scape out of LA. This was their second New York project. And they introduced a whole host of species that really started to make us excited about what it means to design with plants, for plants, in consideration of plants. And specifically, one story I wanted to highlight is this Japanese black pine. So the black pine here, not native to New York. And so we were thinking a lot about what does it mean to think about plants when you're talking about climate change or nativeness or resilience. What is most resilient when the temperature is changing, and what is most resilient inside of a rave? So we're talking about a plant that's being surrounded by people all the time. 1,000 people were there on the opening day. And so this Japanese pine is actually native to high mountain environments, getting blasted by wind and rain, and so it's actually perfect for a rave. People putting cigarettes out, dogs coming by, leaning, like being with people, and it's very resilient. It is completely fine with that kind of environment. So suddenly it was really native to public records. And this was such an exciting moment to think about storytelling and understanding what the future is introducing as an opportunity and not only as a constraint when we're thinking about climate change. So we think about how our projects and our designs work as an ecosystem. And so we have, compost toilets, and we have these timber hats, and we have passive heating, and we have our Japanese black pine. It happened that the black pine was now a stopover for butterfly migration and bird migration. So suddenly this really small abandoned lot that was just an empty concrete slab started to grow into this node not only for community and wildlife. And so it's now been 2 years, and there are so many lovely events there. Highly recommend if you're in Gowanus in Brooklyn. So a little bit about the timber. So we specialize in timber sourcing and timber stories and understanding where wood can come from and what does it mean to bring that wood into your project. And so in this case, the client was really interested in this industrial aesthetic, off-the-shelf materials, simple, accessible design, something that feels like you could copy it, but it's challenging. So we're not talking about bespoke, send someone out to the woods to cut the tree down themselves, mill it. We're talking about sourcing from the lumberyard in Brooklyn. And so what's available at the lumberyard that's ethical? What does ethical mean to public records? And so in this case, we identified a really great story that really matched their goals. And this was Weyerhaeuser's LVL timber product. LVL is laminated veneer lumber. It's automatically biodiverse because it cross-laminates different species together in micro-lambs to become super strong and super straight. This gives us a nice slender profile. And we UV sealed it, which is, a whole conversation about whether wood can breathe or not. But in this case, UV sealing, it prevented graying, and it actually caused public records to have to continually care. And this idea is usually frowned upon. We usually say, no maintenance, please, no sealing, no resealing. That sounds like a nightmare. But I think with this client, they're constantly changing and programming and thinking about the space. And there's always the option that you don't reseal it and it grays. But I think this ritual of caring for it became an asset to their programming. And so they're constantly teaching earth building workshops in the back, and this has this opportunity to be part of that kind of teaching series. And so we created these 2 hats with just off-the-shelf LVL. And then Weyerhaeuser has this incredible story where they are the largest timber company in the country, and you would think, okay, big equals bad. That's usually kind of our mode when we're thinking about sourcing. What's super interesting about them is they were the first company to initiate regenerative timber cultivation. They wrote the script on what it means to replant and regenerate forests on a massive scale. We'll talk a little bit more about them. They also source and produce, grow, and manufacture regionally. So in New York, if you're going to a lumberyard and you're buying a Weyerhaeuser element, it's most likely not from the Pacific Northwest. It's almost guaranteed to be from West Virginia, grown and manufactured. And so they're really paying attention to short distance shipping already kind of for you on your behalf, because that's how they make more money. And so it's a really smart business, and I was really impressed with their story. It's very off the shelf.
So overall, the nursery has become this place that really grew out of a really tiny idea. And I think that with the amazing team and Public Records like leading this vision, bringing people to the site and thinking of ways that telling these stories creates value to their business has helped us also amplify these interests we have in materials. So the collaboration is kind of incredible. So here's people and plants eating together inside the nursery. So as Stephanie mentioned, another interesting part of my practice is advocacy. This project that I was commissioned for at MoMA was called Material Worlds. We did 13 episodes. Each one was on a different material, and I was asked to invite experts from across the spectrum of materials and globally to join this conversation about what's the future of these materials. So here is a matrix of all of the speakers we had on the episodes, and to my horror, they live forever on YouTube, so you can still go check those out. I actually just launched my new website today, which I did link them. But you should definitely take a look. I would highlight absolutely the experts that we've invited, because they are not only architects and designers and planners, but economists, researchers, philosophers, an incredible group of folks. We talked about earth, concrete, steel. We talked about silica, the physicality of the internet. We talked about mass timber was our inaugural episode. And so these folks are delivering their point of view from this place in the world about this topic, and it's just such a great convergence. So after the fact, I made this map to pat myself on the back for how global the conversation was. I really had to visualize it so I could tell everyone how great of a success it was. And I like to remind myself of this because the map actually showed how not global the Material Worlds episodes were. There's massive gaps, right? And so I think it's important as practitioners, as students, as just people in the world to really know where your references are coming from and what stories you're bringing forward in the world. So I would encourage you, as you listen to Material Worlds, know this is the bias and fill in the gaps. Search out, maybe propose a second or, third season to Material Worlds. Some of the headlines, if you had to say, from the conversations were super interesting, but it's interesting to look back now, even a couple of years ago, some of them are already happening. Let's say there was an episode we did with stone and loose stone construction. Stone actually loses strength when it's cooked into concrete. So some of those new scientific discoveries about the permanence of concrete were really discussed in detail in that episode, and it was a fantastic episode, for example. Or Home of the Future has coconut husk air filters, fruit leather shoes, and a dress made of roots. That was a good one too. That was in the photosynthetics episode. And so as a conclusion with this series of Material Worlds, I want to encourage myself and everyone that's practicing this idea of sustainable architecture or conscious architecture or ethical architecture, thinking above and beyond the typical approach towards design, is to kind of stop saying this question. This question is a really difficult question to define. Not a whole lot of people agree on what does it mean to be sustainable. We have LEED, which gives you some kind of point system. It starts to get there, but it's still very relative. So I would love if we start being more specific. Who is sustained by this design, and for how long, and in what way? Because that story is so unique to place and boundary condition. Who are you sustaining in what community, and at what quality of life? So my practice started back in 2017 with these drawings. So this drawing was a first pass at trying to bring this idea of material sourcing into an architect's scope. These three drawings were called Three Material Stories. They were commissioned by a book, a project, and they were shown at the Milan Triennial. And they're part of this bigger idea about sourcing being part of our project. Because typically as architects, means and methods, right, how a material is sourced It's typically a builder's scope, and the architect is merely saying it's wood or it's this kind of wood, and the builder will source that kind of wood from a particular place. And so I'm arguing that we would go further and be much more conscious earlier on in the design process of the implications of these kinds of decisions and directions. And so in this drawing, it's a 6-point perspective or an equirectangular perspective or a 360 drawing, where you can, if you took a photo of this and did panorama mode, you would go inside the drawing. You'd be able to look around at the supply chain. And the supply chain here is unrolled in a way that you could lay it out on a table like a map of the world. And you could say with your team, here's where we need to make a change, redlining this kind of drawing. And what this does is it makes all of these, what were externalities or abstractions, very concrete, very solid, and changeable. And the reason I'm so obsessed, and I'm sure you're also obsessed with this project of material sourcing and material knowledge and our expertise as having so much agency in the world right now, is this little bit of data. This and the next slide, these 2 bits of data. So this was first published in 2022 by ARC 2030, fantastic foundation. Here we see, and they're getting it from the UN, I'm sure. Here we see 23% of global carbon emissions annually are coming from these 3 materials, concrete, steel, and aluminum alone. And that's more than all transportation combined. So all cars, all planes combined are emitting less carbon than these 3 materials, concrete, steel, and aluminum. And those 3 materials, the emissions come from the embodied energy of those materials. So when they're made, when they're manufactured, they require industrial heat, which means they have to be cooked at massive temperatures by definition in order to become steel or concrete or aluminum. And that massive heat generates a massive amount of carbon emissions. And so if we can use even just a little bit less of those materials, we make a massive impact in the world. And you can see here building operations, so the energy burned to light, cool, condition our buildings is also high. However, building operations tracks with capital. In other words, the more energy you save, typically the more money you save. And so we're seeing that number just naturally go down. The thing that's tough is that embodied energy is the opposite. The more emissions you produce in the world, the more money you save. So it goes in the opposite direction. This is why our ability to design with non-emitting materials has a massive impact in the world. And a lot of folks are talking about reducing what we're building, and this does make a huge difference. Stop building so much. Think about how much you really need in a project. Very important. However, the UN, this is predicted in 2019, the UN is showing that for the foreseeable future, in the next 40 years, we're looking at a massive amount of construction, no matter what, and it's not equally distributed around the globe. But what they're talking about, what they're predicting, is the equivalent of all of New York City, so we're talking all 5 boroughs, every level of every tower, being added to the earth every month for 40 years, every month. And so if all of that volume is concrete, steel, and aluminum, there is an equivalent hole being dug, the size of all 5 boroughs, somewhere on the planet every month as well. And so this right here is my guiding light when I wake up in the morning. I think that mass timber has this amazing potential to reduce those 2 numbers and start to replace concrete and steel specifically in urban environments. That's why I focus so much on mass timber. Timber construction in general is really important. There's a lot of great places for light frame or heavy timber projects and buildings. But I think that our ability to reduce concrete steel consumption using timber elements is huge, and it's the first time in the history of the world that timber has been able, strength, fire, water, all of these performance criteria has been able to replace concrete and steel. So this is a massive beginning of an era, and we all have to learn this new thing. We have to learn how to be clients for mass timber building. We have to learn how to be architects of these buildings or teachers. I like to show this graph. It's one of many graphs. It shows that every little bit counts. So the more mass timber you have, the greater reduction in greenhouse gases or global warming potential. So, sorry to skip over that. So this is when you Google mass timber. Maybe I'll pause here and ask a few folks. So when you think about mass timber, what are things you're excited about or worried about? Kelly, do we have a roving mic just in case? We'll take like a couple of things. I want it to be like an honest space, because one of the points of my book is to make sure that timber or mass timber isn't greenwashed. So I went into this research with complete skepticism, and so I wanted to hear from some folks, maybe architects or clients or just students, what are things that really worry you about a whole city made of wood, just as an example. Anyone?
What first comes to mind is like mass logging. I'm concerned about the environment and like if you're looking at local sources of wood, then the local forests surviving this.
Right, so clearing, logging, depletion. So this means that the trees are not regrowing. Right, okay, all right, we'll add that to the list. Yes, we should be worried.
To your knowledge, what is the highest many stories that you can use on a wood frame basis?
Mass timber by the International Building Code that's mainly used in North America is 18 stories allowed today, but there are towers elsewhere that go higher. Yeah, 18 stories. Most buildings are not even that tall. I mean, we're talking the best building for mass timber is like 3 to 8 stories economically at this time. And those are really prevalent in our cities, especially in this city. 5 stories. Any fears, concerns? Tony?
How do they respond? How does the material respond to high temperatures over time? Thinking about Phoenix, imagine in the future we could have 120 days for a month or more, one after the next.
Sure.
Can the material withstand that?
I'll increase your worry to just its response to thermal regulation or thermal difference, heating, cooling, and I'll just add fire there, because I think a lot of folks are worried about fire in general. Okay, good question. Let's add one more to the list. Or two. 2 is great.
Would the price of mass timber be equivalent to steel construction?
Nice, great question. Cost premiums, is it accessible? Does it make sense? It's going to increase rent. It's going to increase the cost of construction. And then I think one more question in the amazing flower shrink. Or a worry.
No, so I don't know much about this, but I guess environmental concerns in terms of lived human environment from treatment of the wood. So long-term release of VOCs or whatever other chemicals are used to treat it to give it longevity.
Fantastic. Okay, maybe one more. So the worry was about VOCs, indoor air quality. Yeah.
Like a transition of steel labor base from concrete to steel over to
Jobs.
yeah,
Jobs
real skill.
and expertise. Absolutely. So we have this education gap happening in all disciplines, and especially builders. 100%. Okay, so these are all really real concerns. I'll add, my main fear going into the book was biodiversity, because you're seeing in all mass timber buildings, they're only using 1 or 2, 3 species. And so if we're hoping for a future that's all plant-based buildings, that's incentivizing monoculture right there. And so even if we have our best foot forward with the current industry as it is now, as a monoculture. And so what does it mean to make that better? So here, for the architects in the room, well, everyone, but for me, I want to share this with young architects, especially. This is a graph done by Bruce King of Europe, and so it really represents global warming potential data across the lifespan of a material, so grow, manufacture, transport, construct, so cradle to grave probably. And on the top line is concrete. So it emits a ton of concrete, not a ton. It emits a lot of carbon into the atmosphere when it's manufactured during the clinker cooking, and then it slowly continues to emit while it's in use. The timber design, which is worst case sourcing, and this means you simply write the word timber and then you go home. I mean, you don't have any knowledge about how to do it well. You just switch out steel column for like wood and you let it go, and the builder figures it out, and it could be from Russia, it could be from Ukraine, it could be from a place you never thought there were forests. It's still better for the environment than concrete. So I want this graph to give us a lot of confidence in moving forward with timber and thinking about its impact on the environment. What this graph also does is show with data that the more we care, the more of a positive impact we literally have on the planet. So the better you are at sourcing timber, the more you're sequestering in the building, the more carbon you're sequestering, and the less carbon you're emitting. And so you can more predictably understand how you're impacting the planet. And so all of these skepticisms and that idea about sourcing well and what does it mean to source well were the reasons behind the book. And this is the book, Designing the Forest and Other Mass Timber Futures. And so I'll dive into a little bit about the book, and then at the end, we'll have a conversation. Here, excuse me. So, the book, I was teaching a studio at Columbia, and the studio started with this prompt that I created when I first started to learn about mass timber. I worked on a project in Germany that was designing the Airbus engine factory of the future. We did mass timber on that. And I was wondering, can we build all of New York's new construction? Can we just replace everything that's being built in New York right now, every year, with mass timber from the state's trees? Could it be locally sourced without being depleting? And that means that you have to understand how the forest works. So if we were to take that seriously, we started to look at what are the most prevalent species in New York's forest. It's not the typical species that mass timber uses today, spruce, pine, and fir. It's beech, maple, and hemlock. And they produce a different, first of all, they mature at a different time scale than other softwoods. They also mature at a different time scale than each other. We have 200 years, 75 years, and 100 years. And already when we're trying to tap into this resource, it's already a multi-generational project. 200-year time scale, and you're replanting for mass timber specifically. You better hope that the future generations are on the same wavelength, right? So already it's a kind of like philosophical, political, social topic. And then it got even more interesting. When we tried to determine these maturity timescales, nobody had a clear answer. You can determine maturity of a tree by how big the sawmill blade is that's on the premises. Like, okay, that fits in our building, it's mature. Or you could say that tree has naturally regenerated, it's finally dropped its seeds after 150 years, now it's mature. And so it depends on your forest management plan, on the way that you think about the forest. It depends on what you value. And it's so complex immediately. And I mean, I'm kind of obsessed with it, but it's not the same as just replacing concrete with wood. You have to really have this understanding about what it means to source from the woods. So I looked at how much volume, in this hypothetical forest. I mean, these are all not, they're not grown in this grid, right? These are all just among each other too, so you have to have the selective harvesting scheme that's implied, but we know how much volume would grow on each acre of these species, which depends on the canopy size and the height and the diameter breast height, and in this case they produce a really wide range of square foot, which would be in mass timber building, 400, 530, and 800 square foot. So if we were when we're thinking about sustainability design, it's usually like the most carbon we want to optimize, maximize. In this case, when you're thinking about biodiversity, you would leave behind most species if you had a maximize or minimize mindset. I think it's much more about diversity and I guess maximizing diversity. So once we know how much volume is produced every mature cycle, we can also track how much carbon is in that harvest. Also completely different because the trees suck up carbon at a different time scale as well. And we learned that if you were to look at this total amount of acres around the state, so millions of acres producing this, cycling, so trees are growing, they're getting cut down, they're replanted, growing back, same amount of maturity, getting harvested, replanting, and we're trying to tap into that time scale, and every time they're harvested, it goes to the city for material. So there's never depletion. The city gets on the time scale and the cycles, the carbon cycle of the forest, and it's possible to build way more than New York typically builds. Like the volume is not an issue. So when you're thinking about depletion, after this study, excuse me, so this study was sponsored by UN Environment. It was like one of the only biodiverse papers presented at this conference. And what it showed was that you have this ability to do the math, like volume totally works out just fine. We have more than enough trees on the planet to build all the cities out of mass timber. But when you think about New York, it's all chopped up into private lots. It's so much more of a political issue. You have to get every private owner on the same forest management plan. You have to have a massive amount of agreement that this is the future we want. And that's really our struggle. That's actually now my biggest fear, is that our disagreement about what does it mean to create a future that has zero emissions. It's not really a depletion issue. So it's an interesting premise, like a theory, that you can have a cycle. And if I take my own advice, that's not an all or nothing theory. So we can keep thinking about what does it mean to source from the forest and learn from the forest. And once you start to think about the complexity of the forest, sourcing becomes even more challenging. So for example, this phenomenal forest ecologist, Suzanne Simard, she recently proved that old trees teach young trees how to survive drought, pests, and wildfire. And so if you're planting only young trees everywhere, you're losing actual intelligence. And she's also shown in her, sorry, it's so dry here. She's also shown in her studies that softwoods will help hardwoods serve, or the opposite, softwoods, conifers will help hardwoods survive the winter by moving sugars and other kinds of materials underground. So there's this collaboration between multi-species and multi-generational forests that is resilience. And so if we're talking about plant-based cities, we need to understand that relationship, because we have to harvest in a way that supports those relationships moving forward. And so there are people working on this, including her. And what's amazing is that our species, humans on this planet, we've actually been really good at this for a lot longer than we have been relying on fossil fuels. Cities prior to oil were designed at the same time as the forest was designed. It's an intentional cultivation. Forests are designed spaces historically. And so here's one of many examples. 6,000-year-old pollen records show that this society was designed around the cultivation of a forest inside, co-located with the settlement. And these are edible trees, these are building materials. It's a co-located design project. And that's what I think is super interesting about mass timber. When we source mass timber, we're designing the forest, right? We're making that space different. But we can't take for granted that that is a project. And it doesn't mean that because it's a project that it's a good project. And so how do we define the kind of project we want to do? Colonialism, industrialization, this was also a sustainability project. And it was about designing forests, but it was about designing forests that produce monocultures in places that were not co-located with the societies that they sustained. And so we are inheriting a lot of those spaces today, and our society is still really reliant on paper towels, paper products that are coming from palm oil, that are coming from the same ground. So what I'm interested in is defining what does it mean to support or source from, put the money in the pockets of folks doing interesting forest management, ethical forest management. You probably hear about these projects like Billion Tree Project, Trillion Tree Project, and what is kind of troubling is that a lot of the mainstream understanding of forest quality is about numbers, counting. If you have a lot of trees, it's good. But that's not necessarily true, and this is why it's tough, because it's complex. What this does, like Billion Tree Project, has been known to be incentivizing the removal of big, old, crooked trees to replace them with 1,000 tiny trees, and then, get the pledge accomplished. And so that is a challenge. Understanding how to measure and track and map biodiversity is the cutting edge of forest ecology today. And this is where you want to have your eyes, like what forest should we be sourcing from or learning about or incentivizing is a forest that is focused on biodiversity, mapping like under canopy, over canopy. This is like very difficult. I just went to a really not boring conference on LiDAR during Climate Week. They talked a lot about this. And so as architects, designers, folks that are interested in doing the ethical thing, I'm sure these stamps, these certifications maybe seem familiar. So FSC, SFI, these are ethical descriptions of what it means to source well when you're doing wood. And they are really good. They are about regeneration. They are about equitable labor conditions in the forest. I just think there should be a lot more of them, because SFI, for example, the original text was written by Weyerhaeuser. And so we're coming back full circle where this company is massive. They have an incredible history, and they had this great impact in inventing or introducing regenerative timber cultivation to the US. However, they're cultivating for a particular species, Douglas fir. It's like very optimal product. It's super straight, super fast monoculture. And so that ethical description incentivizes that species. And so where are the other certifications? We're missing hundreds, thousands. And I would love to see just more people in this space making these definitions. And so if we unroll the supply chain of mass timber and timber in general, who is at that table saying, here's how we should value this particular species, here's how we should value this particular land? I think that there is just so much room for more interpretations of value. When I go visit my local forest to go on a mushroom foray, I usually go to the main center there, and it's called the Center of Interpretation. And I always love that because it's exactly what forest ecologists know is their job. You go there and you interpret the value. There's no, objective description of these places, and it really matters who's there making this decision. A couple of examples of why this is so critical today. Here's a photo I took upstate New York. We have deciduous trees, hardwoods, generally on the right, softwoods, conifers on the left. So conifers, evolutionarily speaking, are much older than deciduous trees. They were like the first trees. They created seed systems and reproductive systems that relied on water and wind. Deciduous trees came along later, and they had better technology. They had convinced animals to move their seeds for them. So this means that these two trees migrate at different speeds. And this understanding is changing all of forest management today. Forest management has to do what's called assisted migration packages they're offering to the forest. And they have to do it fast because the trees are moving north. I worked with Black Rock Forest, this 100-acre forest right outside New York City. They have been managing the land for 100 years. And in those 100 years, they've tracked 13 different species enter and leave the premises. That's how fast these trees are trying to run north because the temperature is changing so rapidly. And so if groups don't believe in assisted migration, the trees are facing extinction. And so here's an example of a forest owner knowledge and education being so critical. I think it's also important that whether you're doing FSC or SFI, our whole forest system in the US is still relying on forced labor conditions anyways. And so just because we're in North America doesn't mean that we're not dependent on a lot of these same systems. And I'm still not sure like what to do with it, like a real call to action here. I think it's just important to know because a lot of like say FSC was being exported to other countries as if those countries had a problem, like a forced labor condition problem in the forest, when we have a lot of work to do. And so, speaking of a lot of work to do, all the way across the supply chain, there's so much at stake, and there's a lot that we can do. So as people that influence the built environment, of course we should build less. When we do build, we should be sourcing timber from a place that's designed with cultural and environmental resilience in mind. And to kind of close out, I'll give you 3 examples of where that's happening already. Number 1, the Menominee tribe that's kind of smack in the middle of the state of Wisconsin. They had this great article in the New York Times recently. Their property, so they're here. So this is a snap from my book. I'm mapping forest owners because ownership ends at the property line, but the land, soil, the air continues, right? And so whoever is managing that, talking about what we should do there, changes the forest. And here is their place, their nation. And when they were put on the reservation, the chief Oshkosh said, okay, we're going to be the first sawmill, we're going to be independent economically. They still run the first indigenous sawmill in North America. They have sustained the community since then, and they have a really particular forest management harvest scheme, which is that you walk in a straight line and you only take already down or sick trees. That's their management plan. It's super clear, it's geometric. You get to the other side and you come back. And that's the rules. And they follow those rules every time they harvest. And their land is more biodiverse than any other place in the region, and super prolific when it comes to exporting timber and lumber. Menominee. The second example is the Taposh Collective, which is in the Pacific Northwest. So, subchapter of this whole talk could be about like checkerboarding in the Pacific Northwest. You should just, if you don't know about checkerboarding, just Google that and go down that rabbit hole. What this does to the forest is just breaks it up. It was like an intentional project to break up the land, to make it non-contiguous. But now they're trying to figure out how to come back together because the land is not, behaving, especially when it comes to mega fires. And so what's amazing about this group is that they're getting everyone on the table, public, private, tribal forest owners to agree on a massive forest management plan. So when we're talking about New York being able to actually supply the mass timber for all of New York City, you have to get everyone on the same plan. They're doing it here. And the first step that they're doing is bringing back indigenous coal burning, because small fires prevent massive fires. And we've never really had that, like white settlers, European settlers stopped a lot of the coal burning that was happening in the region, which was causing a lot of the issues. And then finally, the best forest you could possibly source from is a forest that could sue you, hands down. If a forest can sue you, you know it's a forest that has resilience. This is called personhood, or nature is giving personhood, legal personhood. It was an idea, it's been an idea in indigenous cultures, and that's a broad generalization for a really long time. But it was first written about by an environmental economist in 1971, fantastic book, that talked about, why do corporations in America get personhood in the legal system when a river does not, or a mountain does not? When we have the rights to go buy a mountain-like property and blow it up, it's actually a collective value, this mountain, this river, water is flowing into other people's properties and right into other people's, sinks and bathtubs. How is this not a collective thing? And really viewed as a corporation for having legal personhood. And so here's an example of a forest that has legal personhood. And then I had to kind of find these people's faces on Facebook to really put a face to a name, because they had a list of people who represent the forest as its council. But I really wanted to show you, these are actual people who go there and listen to the forest for a job. And they're not forest ecologists or scientists. They're of many disciplines. So their interpretation of value comes from all kinds of places, and then they come together and they agree on what's the forest management plan that best fits, what does this forest want to be. And they treat it like a corporation would. How do we direct this legal person into the future, just like a corporation? So it's a fantastic example of this, and there's a few around the world, and hopefully more to come. So with that, I'll open up to our conversation. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. That was really enlightening and informative, and I love the way you engaged the audience and surveyed everyone on what their kind of preconceptions were. Maybe to open up the questions, I'm wondering what were your preconceptions as you embarked on this research? How did that change, and when did the idea of choreography emerge in that?
That's a great question. I was just realizing maybe I didn't quell some of the concerns like Tony's fire, water, pests. I guess as I started to learn about mass timber, it was really easy to answer those performative questions. There's a lot of data out there that shows the fire performance. There's this amazing part of mass timber that is called char layer, or the fact that it can char, that timber can char, is actually its fire resistance. So charring actually puts out the fire. I mean, a lot of these initial studies, people couldn't believe that it was happening because no other material puts itself out. And so it has this unique ability to do that, and you just spec this much per hour for char layer, and it's really simple. So I think I was kind of bored by the technical side, really bored by the technical side, because it was very easy to achieve, even though it's tough in a project. We have to have a lot of education happening all the time across all disciplines to make sure that everyone's up to speed on those kinds of things. But the thing it seemed like a lot longer project, I could work on this my whole life, was this idea about interpretation of value. What does it mean to source from this place? Who are you voting for with your sourcing? You're kind of putting money in their pocket, saying, I love your approach to trees. And I think that's really neat to think about architects as people who have that power, that opportunity. Yeah.
I think on that note of interpretation, the illustrations that are in the book and the way that you represent these relationships is really rich, and it's a way of doing research and highlighting different value systems as you go through your thinking process. In what way is representation and these diagrams kind of generative of the research and vice versa?
Yeah, I should have brought a book I was mentioning. So the book has 100 drawings in it. It's like a 40,000 word document. And the drawings are line drawings, and the idea of the line drawing is to make something that is like a vignette connected tissue of this idea of sourcing into a line, like a measurable architectural drawing. So it's building from the history of 3 material stories as line drawings of this externality of material sourcing. And so that was the project there, is to make something that's typically been invisible, visible in these 100 drawings. And then there are also drawings that are called equivalents. And this series of drawings is on these yellow pages in the book. These drawings show how abstract carbon is. When someone says, oh, you saved 10 tons of carbon, it's like, what is that? Is that big? Is that small? Is that for how long? Like, that could be, you could tell a story saying, that's very tiny, that's not enough. Or you could say, oh my gosh, that's an incredible amount. So what does it mean? So in those drawings, I'll say things like the carbon sequestered by one cross-laminated timber panel is equivalent to wearing a sweater for 2 winters instead of turning a thermostat up 3 degrees. That's the amount of energy that's there. And so it starts to relate those really abstract things to the body and to, you know, yourself and your understanding of the world at scale. And then there are the maps. That's like the third type of drawing. And these maps were using public data sources that weren't yet compared. So it's forest, location, and ownership. So it's just a forest ownership map, but they didn't exist. And so you could see who and what kinds of groups are owning the forest in all of the world. So they're global maps, and specifically a lot of data for the US using USDA data. And it just shows that there are lots of broken up places, lots of private ownership, and then within private ownership, all kinds of types of owners. There's real estate investment trusts that own huge amounts of forests, and so who do we, try to de-abstract that as well. So that's the idea, is to kind of put more knowledge out there, or to reveal something that is so big or very abstract, to make it more easily part of your daily process of design.
Hi, Lindsay. Enjoyed the lecture. And just to tag on to what you were describing, I personally have been really enthralled with this idea of the demystification of architecture. I think the vernacular of architecture and the practice is so foreign and alien to the layman. So that's fantastic that you're grounding in these easy to understand concepts like the wearing the sweater. And the thing that I've been most concerned in my education is there's such a focus on design and not the implication or consideration for the weight of the process, and exactly kind of what you're focused on, where the materials are coming from, what these materials are being used for, who and what they are sustaining. I guess asking how can we make that more prevalent in pedagogy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, do you remember the graph that said any timber is good timber? So I would just encourage everyone, even if you're not going deep into the sourcing, to start by learning how to design with timber. That's a whole project, not just, how do you detail a beam to a column? What does it mean to be in a wood building? And what is it like to be there? Does it make sense for that kind of gathering? How can you make it different? I think there's so much value there. Because a huge part of this plant-based city future is a bunch of people that are architects living in it and liking it. And if you can, I mean, imagine the like cattle track is a super woody building, and it's dark in there. Yeah, I mean, it's like high contrast with the windows. The wood is really, rich. It's beautiful, but maybe not everyone would want to live there every day. And so I think this ability to create spaces that are irresistible is honestly the most powerful thing. Because you can also source really well in a lot of different ways, but I think both are a practice. And you really can't do everything all at once. So you kind of have to learn how to do both of those as part of your practice. And then you'll also, discover so much about yourself along the way. So I think learning how to design and respond to a prompt and to think about what a client, working with a client is like, it's a critical skill, especially if you eventually want to do mass timber and timber, because those are definitely part of it's even more critical, convincing people to do something super unknown and risky. Because concrete and steel they're a lot more easy to put in a pro forma. They're a lot more easy to create a project schedule around because it is a good, more or less, I'm generalizing, but like copy paste from previous projects. And mass timber really throws a lot of previous approaches in the air. There's a lot of design that happens up front, a lot of capital expense way earlier on in a project, but so much is gained down the road. So you have to have this built trust with the team, with the client, and that doesn't come out of just being able to source mass timber. So I would, give yourself some time and just remember that graph. You'll be fine. Read my book, I guess. I appreciate the question. Yeah.
The comment about that you made earlier about de-abstracting, I think is interesting because I'm thinking about your body of work. I'm back. And your architectural projects, and you didn't talk too much about aesthetics, but of course there is an underlying aesthetic project, and like how much of that is related to the kind of de-abstraction of the architectural assembly or detail as a kind of educational tool for people experiencing the projects.
Yeah, I think we've had a lot of conversation with clients about what it means to live with this wood that is in their project, and that conversation really determines the way that the wood is sealed or addressed when it comes to maintenance. I was talking about UV sealant that prevents graying. That's it sounds really simple and technical and boring, and maybe it is. But it's like a really big fork in the road for a lot of people. Do you want to deal with this resealing every year to keep the wood look? Or do you want it to gray and have no maintenance? That's a really different kind of person. And this ability to understand that fork in the road kind of determines a lot that we could do about like having knots or clear wood and then different species or even mixed species in the project. And so it's totally a conversation about different projects. So for example, in a project I didn't show, the Parkview Mountain House, which is a retreat that's short-term kind of winter stay in Park City, Utah, operated by a company called Globazin out of Toronto. They opted for a non-UV sealed knotty cedar facade. And for them, it was the right thing because they only had to wash it down like once a year with water and never going to reseal it. It looked like the forest and it smelled like the forest when you arrived, and that was like their brand. I think that's like so exciting to find the right combination of aesthetics and species, and then also the sourcing being cost effective. It's such a multi-dimensional part of the process. But I agree, I'll come back and lecture and talk about that more. I was told once that I don't show any interiors to the projects, and I was shocked. So yeah, around next episode. Yeah, I should do that. We have a good amount of projects up, on the new website now today, so you can kind of take a look there. But I think it is a super interesting part of it. It's really important, to talk about.
Congrats on the website, by the way.
Thanks. Yeah,
so cool. Karen, you were about to ask something.
Well, I was just thinking like the different clients wanting different approaches to like how they're interacting with the material. Like I feel like that even further like emphasizes the identity of or essence of material that's like beyond that of just like observing it about where it's sourced or how it's being sealed or cared for. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's different in this, for example, in the hospitality project in Park City, no one is living there and looking at it every day. I think that really does change things too. When you're going and staying at a place and having this new experience on a vacation or a retreat, like this retreat was really designed for scholars. So you go there and you finish your book or you compose a score or something. You're not going there every single day after work. And so a knotty piece of wood is not going to feel busy or have this energy about it that might be different if you had a lot of activity in the floor in your home, which you're looking at every day. And so that living with the wood is kind of maybe this will be my next lecture. We think a lot about that. What does it mean to care for it? What does it mean to look at it all the time? Sometimes we've compared it with clients that are, new to like maintenance or that kind of routine. Thinking about it like your skin. Like you would never say, I don't have time to shower. Or like I'm never gonna. I want a maintenance-free life, and I don't want to like cook. Or I just like don't want to eat. I want to drink it out of a bottle and move forward. Maintenance-free. No, it's like an experience. It's part of the culture of your household, and so you can have wood in your daily life that enriches that, and so it doesn't have to be this like chore. So I think about it more like skincare or cooking or something like that could be much more exciting and invigorating, and just trying to find the right version of that for folks.
That kind of relates to like the forest societies that you were mentioning, right? Like interacting with kind of these like essential defining aspects or variables in our life instead of like describing them or like seeing them as burdens. Like sustainability is an opportunity. Like these are all opportunities for maybe unique human experiences.
Mic drop.
This might be a good time to open it up to the audience if there are questions. Yeah, Win.
I'm just going to try and.
Yeah.
One of the concerns that brought up that occurred to me while you were Q&A-ing what everyone's concerns were was the financial aspect of it. And once finances are in order, it's kind of like, well, then what about the economical accessibility aspect of it? Because once the unfortunate truth of the world that we do live in is that the economy kind of runs how we live our lives and everything. And once something gets commoditized, when something becomes desirable or commoditized, it starts to lose the accessibility that the people originally had the accessibility to have. So, like my question is like, how moving forward, how do we approach this in a way where we can ensure that the accessibility is there for people?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for the cost of timber is a super interesting challenge or opportunity, and I also didn't address it enough. this is there are entire conferences on this topic, so I'm generalizing in an enormous way here. But in general, a lot of people say that there's a green premium on anything that's sustainable, so mass timber included, of about 10%. So take whatever you had as a budget for the building and add 10%, that's probably mass timber. Other folks are saying that if you can do this in-time delivery, having everything prefabricated and arrive on site at the exact time it's going up and the building is kind of put up in a couple of days, then you're actually getting back that 10% in opening quicker, especially if you're renting out the spaces or selling them. And so understanding that choreography is next level. I mean, it's brand new pro formas, it's whole new site teams, builders that really understand how that works. It is a lot of new education and new knowledge. And they exist. There's amazing new startups and companies that are specializing in this delivery. But then, so you can make it accessible or just as accessible as previous material approaches if you really understand that way of doing things. There's also the team building and fundraising and like sponsorship of sustainable life spaces. So I know of a lot of nonprofits that find ways to use mass timber in projects because it is part of their story too. And so without it, they wouldn't have had the same kind of support as they did when they started to really build the physical structure with the material that really told the exact story they wanted to tell. And so you can't really discount those kinds of financial approaches. And then I think when it comes to like living space or literal accessibility is pretty interesting. Living in a mass timber building is a really different experience. Has anyone ever met anyone that lives in a mass timber building? Okay, you have? No way.
It's common, like, because I'm from M.Arch, so it's common as a building material to build timber.
Okay.
So, like, maybe it's not really like mass timber, but like in a full wooden building with floors that are creaking and the wind is like flowing in from the floors.
Oh, okay.
Floorboards, I've also been in buildings where, you know, it's made of super quality wood where there's like a heaviness to it and it breathes and it smells, and so, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned two amazing points. So the VOCs, we talked about VOCs earlier, and you're talking about solid sawn heavy timber, so no glue involved. It smells amazing, there's really no treatment, it's all enclosed, it's conditioned, so there's not a lot of thermal issues, and it's protected. But those are really low density structures, and those have been allowed for a long time. And heavy timber and lightweight wood will never replace concrete and steel in urban environments because they cannot compete with the fire performance. And so mass timber, on the other hand, has cross-laminated timbers or lumber. So if you imagine 2x6s being laid down in a line, and then another layer of 2x6s, and then another layer of 2x6s, and then another layer of 2x6s, all glued together to be like a giant piece of plywood, and that's your concrete deck that can span like 12 to 30 feet, depending on how thick it is and what species it is. And that's mass timber. And when you live in that building, it creaks in a whole new way. So the sound of it is wild. It still smells incredible for a really long time. It is sappy. This is like the best thing I've ever learned. Sap just falls on all your stuff. I couldn't believe it. Talk about like learning to live with that. So to me, it's interesting to know that because it just feels like such early days. Like we're gonna look back on this time when sap used to just fall from the ceiling, and like, wow, that was what a time to be alive with mass timber. And then the VOCs with the glue, it's an interesting issue. So how much time? Yeah, I don't want to be too nerdy. Okay. there's two types of glue that are very common. There's the PUR glue and pure glue, and that glue is like no formaldehyde in it, and so there's no VOCs ever, not when it's originally applied and not over time. But that glue doesn't meet fire standards of urban environments, because if a fire happened underneath it, it would just melt and all the laminations would delaminate into the fire. And so if you're designing with PUR glue or pure glue, you have to design the edge of the panel to be physically supported so that the pieces don't fall down. And if you do that, you could convince the fire marshal that that satisfies the requirement, but good luck with that. So most often it's just a base formaldehyde glue that only off-gasses when it's applied, which means that it's only hurting those who are manufacturing it. So it's it's very similar to like quartzite countertops and the silica dust, like cancer issues that we're seeing in the news right now. That of course people in our home, we're not having this issue, but we're purchasing these like, you know, quartzite countertops or quartz. I always forget which one it is. It's one or the other. Is it quartz? Quartz countertops. So we're purchasing them, and we love the look in our kitchens, and we're putting the money into the companies that are kind of allowing, or, you know, not allowing, I mean, the fact that it's a product is causing everyone that's involved in making it have cancer. Like, just, it's illegal in Australia because of this. And so similarly, the formaldehyde is tough for manufacturers because they're applying it in the space. So I've been to factories to like see how they deal with this, and it's a whole thing. But once it's in your space and it's off gas, it doesn't emit anything else anymore. And so it's interesting, this idea of really starting to understand how your decisions affect much more than just you. And then how far do you go? That's the next level of question.
Sorry, I have a question. So I'm interested in using some sort of mass timber, maybe like LVLs, for my thesis shelter build next semester. And I was just wondering if you have any advice for that kind of procurement of that, and as well as how I should kind of look into like treating the wood, like not treating, but like how I should kind of utilize and respect the wood if it's going to be kind of exposed to the elements, I would say, in Arizona.
Yeah, it sounds like you have to decide what you care about. Do you want it to grade? Do you want it to look like wood? How long do you want it to last? What's its end of life? I think this is an interesting part of designing spaces with clients, especially homes. Designing for disassembly or end of life for materials. When we started this lecture, we thought about this room going somewhere someday. Like, what's the end of life for all of these materials? It's a really deep kind of emotional thought for people who are spending so much effort, so much money on their home to imagine it not existing. It's like really tough for us as humans, as Americans, to face that. It's pretty philosophical. So I would go there and then see how that story, those values lead you in a direction. Yeah.
We have time for a couple more questions.
Real quick, this is a two-part question, but so the first one, welcome back, Lindsey, to Arizona.
Nice to see
Still
you.
hot. First question is, what's the biggest challenge now that you have your own practice in terms of convincing developers or changing the argument to where this becomes profitable in the future? Like, what's that roadmap to where that performer works in their favor? Because I think that's the only way it's ever going to change, is it has to be profitable. And then the second question, real quick, is, in the space of thermally modified woods, there's a lot of companies out there, and I don't know if they're necessarily operating in the mass timber space yet, but they do open up the door to using wood in a lot of climates, especially Arizona, where it's frowned upon if you propose natural wood, but these have opened up the door for natural wood projects, and I've been fortunate to actually create a couple of those. But their argument's the exact opposite, where it's zero maintenance, right? And that's the only reason that we're able to convince clients to use wood again in Arizona, is because of the fact that it's they're offering warranties that are 30 years. It's not going to chip, crack, or whatever. It will fade. So there is still that one kind of proponent of maintenance if you want it to look brown. Otherwise, it will gray or silver. So yeah, those are the two questions.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the profitability, I think it does take a particular client to see the value. Prior to the pandemic, there was an amazing initiative by Hines, the massive developer, doing Class A office space with mass timber. They did this prototype that they put in, I think, 12 different cities, and it was a mass timber, like patented kit of parts that would deploy. And the Class A use was super helpful because they wanted to attract companies that really wanted to attract like young people that want to be working all day in a healthy, sustainable space. And so that value was going really well until the pandemic, and then everyone started working from home. And so I still think there's a lot of potential there. You know, I'm working with a developer in Indianapolis that is just kind of so sick of status quo that they're just willing to go down this route and create healthy homes for people. Like that's what they want their brand to be. That's what they want their legacy to be. Creating healthy spaces where you are surrounded by wood and you feel like you're connected with nature. One of the most powerful, I think, links between mass timber and healthy space is this relationship to forest bathing. Everyone's heard of forest bathing? I think it's always kind of in the news, and then it comes back in the news that people are talking about connecting with. I heard it on the radio actually yesterday, driving back from Sedona. Turns out scientists tell you they could just prescribe, go outside for a second, it's really good for you. Wow. But it's true, if you go into a forest for 15 minutes, your cortisol levels go down by 14%. It's more than taking a bath or meditating. It's a phenomenal amount. And being in a wood building, it's been shown to do 7%. And so imagine the scale of the health impact. As soon as I start thinking about the health impacts of mass timber and who's paying for health, it starts to get super political and challenging because of just healthcare in general. But I think that folks that value their own health want to live in those spaces, and so developers are going to find absolutely lots of people who are willing to be in those kinds of spaces. And the second question about thermally modified wood. So thermally modified wood, in order to be used in construction, has to be baked in a kiln. So it's just like a giant oven, and it has to be dried out to a certain percentage. So mass timber is more expensive than typical lumber because you're drying into even drier amounts so that you can glue it in a really predictable way. And so thermally modified is like if you left it in the oven and it just baked until there was like no lignin left. Nothing for pests to eat or water to rot. It's just the other parts. And it's pretty incredible technology. It just, the more you leave it in the kiln, the higher the energy. I would be curious to see that graph for thermally modified wood, like if that wood is actually better than concrete, but it's actually not structural, so thermally modified, it's just like a cladding. So
is it kind of the right direction pushing towards mass timber,
resilient.
or is it counterintuitive to that?
No, it's not counterintuitive. It's just it's another option in this like really wide array of materials that can be used in a project. I think mass timber, I haven't heard of any like thermally modified mass timber yet, but it is interesting to think about how you can dial it in. I heard about a timber product, a mass timber product that just came online it's called like super wood, and what they're doing is just squishing the wood really hard, like under this massive press. So CLT is cross-laminated timber is pressed, but this is like pressing it even more. And so it's making it more like steel. And so it's increased its strength to weight ratio by a lot. And these inventions kind of keep popping up. I honestly don't think the market is tracking with those inventions. So there's almost like more inventions than a market. So I'm more interested, in like the culture around it? How do we get a bigger movement that's interested in this? Because it is a little bit like supply and demand, and the demand is very low. I've been writing a lot of articles and op-eds about how demand changes the forest of this country. Like the more timber we use, the better. So just one sentence about that. Timber lands that are owned are competing in value to agriculture or urban development. And so that timber has got to be super valuable for it to not just be cleared for cattle or beef or soy. So like the tariffs on soy, or tariffs on China, and China stopped buying soy, prevented massive amounts of clearing for soy. And so the more timber we buy, or just anything, thermally modified, whatever, like more and more and more timber, it's going to actually protect the forest from real depletion, which is land conversion. So I would say all timber, all the time, no matter what it is going to really help things. So the market is the lowest, most challenging thing. Thanks for asking that question.
Appreciate it.
There was a question in the front, and then BJ, and then I would say those could be our last two questions.
When I see the need for establishing multi-generational compacts to say we want to continue this process of growing new forests using these new methods, I can't help but think about the big changes that we've seen in materials sciences. And for example, just with glazing, how far glazing has come in modern architecture, and how well it performs under all conditions, and that we're starting to see that it can be photovoltaic, so you can actually generate electricity off of the glass, and we can control how much light comes through, and we can control its strength and so forth. So I'm just thinking about wood as as another material, but that maybe there's a marketing case to be made for the beauty of it or the health aspects of it as it competes with new materials. So,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, just a quick response. Concrete was, invented by Romans and that whole long history, but more the modern version of concrete was introduced kind of at the turn of the century, around the 1900s, and specifically exploded after the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco, when the only buildings that didn't fall were concrete. And so that's how long concrete's been around, 100 plus years. So we are just at the beginning. We have 100 years ahead of us of mass timber construction, and think about how far concrete has come, or how far these other materials have come. And so it's an exciting time. I mean, I think about how much more we can, more intelligence we can embed in these systems. I do think about AI a lot, because I have this dream that we would have the most biodiverse mass timber products available, so you could source locally with all kinds of species, and that kind of complexity can really only be managed by these types of systems. And so that could be a really interesting future where AI is actually helping us manage the forest in a super resilient way, like super selective harvest, tree by tree. Yeah. We have one here.
One more. BJ, you had your hand up.
Well, one thing I really like is LVLs, especially the one where Weyerhaeuser comes out. The one problem is with using those pieces instead of like a glue lamp. The glue lamp you use like almost about another 70% the size. The LVL is a lot less weight and a lot smaller for the same engineering specs. But the LVLs require an engineering spec that is stamped on the LVL, so that it takes a certain weight and a certain spec. The problem is that right now we don't have a lot of the technicians to be able to put good LVLs in a lot of things, because the zoning codes require that you do not, penetrate the LVL in certain spaces. So, there's a cost factor and that's where it all comes down to. It's a cost factor of having a technical advanced product being able to be installed correctly in a situation that, would take a higher effective labor cost involved with it. But LVLs are a great source of everything, but you just have to be real cognizant of the engineering specs on them.
Yeah, I mean, cross-laminated timber, or there's all sorts of mass timber products, dowel-laminated timber. LVL is more of like an engineered wood product. Mass timber is really, I like to focus on things that can replace concreted steel. So that's how I would define it. And when you're working with those elements, every single manufacturer has a different size. So there's no standardization. And so the code is like, how do we manage how you can work with the material? And plus there's tons of prefabrication coordination up front. So the little hole that has to be drilled in the factory for the fire resistance to go through, if it's half an inch over, you're in trouble. And so there's so much thought that has to go into the system ahead of time. And that's really different for people because it's easier to kind of bring wood to the site, think about it, kind of cut it, adjust it, sand it on the site. And so mass timber is much more like steel than even concrete, because concrete is really like poured and you're kind of dealing with it on site. Yeah, it's so tricky. It's tricky. I agree. It's tricky. Thank you all for your questions.
Thank you so much.